The wind blew through the broken windows. Dust danced in the pale light. The room was silent. Heavy with sadness, 3 alien children sat in the corner, huddled together, skin pale, eyes empty. They didn't speak, they didn't cry, they were too tired to make any sound, too hungry to move. A soft step echoed outside. Then the door creaked open. A human man stepped in. His name was Mason. He was tall, but his shoulders were low with exhaustion. His clothes were torn, covered in ash. His face was hard, but his eyes were tired. In his hand, he held a small, cracked metal bowl. Inside the bowl was all he had, half a piece of dried bread and a little water. It wasn't enough for even one full meal, but to someone starving, it was everything. Mason looked at the children. They didn't move. One of them blinked slowly. Like he was dreaming, the others just stared at the floor. Mason walked forward. Step by step, he didn't say a word. He knelt down in front of them and placed the bowl on the dusty floor. Then he broke the bread into 3 pieces, small and rough. He dropped the pieces into the bowl and poured the water over them. It made a wet, soft mash, barely food, but it was warm and it was real. Mason pushed the bowl toward the children. They looked at him, confused. Why would he do this? He didn't know them. He was not their kind. Mason stood up slowly. His knees cracked. He turned away and walked toward the broken door. The children still didn't speak. He left the room, stepped outside, and sat down on a pile of rubble. The cold wind hit his face. His stomach growled. He ignored it behind a shattered wall. Someone was watching him. Her name was Zira. She was a teenage alien girl with sharp eyes and dirt on her face. She had been watching the building since morning when she saw Mason walk in. She thought he might take something, food, supplies, anything useful. That's what survivors did. That's what she would have done, but he didn't take, he gave. And then he walked away like it was nothing. Zira's people believed in strength. Weak ones were left behind. Sharing food was dangerous, it meant death, but this human had just given his last food to strangers. Why? Zira narrowed her eyes. She didn't understand him. He didn't even ask for thanks. He just sat there. Alone, cold, and hungry, she looked back at the children. They were eating now, slow and quiet. One of them smiled for the first time in days. Another one whispered something to the youngest, who nodded weakly. They were alive because of him. Zira looked at the human again. His hands were shaking, his eyes were closed, but he didn't sleep. She could feel something strange inside her. Not fear, not anger, something warm and unfamiliar. Respect maybe. She stayed hidden. She didn't speak. But her view of him was already changing. In her heart, she had always hated humans. They had brought war. They had destroyed her home. But this one. He didn't act like a monster. He acted like a protector, like a leader. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his past. But she knew one thing. This human was different. And maybe, just maybe, he was what they needed. Zira did not sleep that night. She sat on the edge of the broken roof, knees pulled close to her chest. Watching the strange human from the shadows, he hadn't moved much, just sat still outside the room. Where the children had eaten, the stars above flickered like tired lamps. But the man's presence stayed solid and unmoving. She had expected him to leave after giving the food, to go look for more supplies or find safety for himself. But instead, he stayed. Like he had nowhere else to be. Like those children mattered more than his own survival, Zira touched the edge. Of her own sharp claws, they had never trembled before. But now they did, just a little, back in her old clan. If you showed weakness, you were ignored. If you gave away food, you were mocked. Or worse, left behind. And yet, this man had done exactly that. Not for power, not for thanks. He hadn't even looked back when he left the bowl behind. That confused her more than anything. The next morning, the children came out slowly. They were still weak, but now they looked around with quiet eyes. One of them reached for Mason's hand. He didn't pull away, he smiled, just a little, and nodded. The youngest one tried to mimic the smile, but only managed a twitch. Still, Mason chuckled, the sound warm and human. Zero felt it echo strangely. Inside her chest, she waited until the sun was high before approaching. He noticed her first, but said nothing. His hand didn't go to his weapon. His eyes just met hers, steady and calm. "You gave them everything," she said finally, her voice sharp but uncertain. He nodded once. Like it wasn't a big deal. Zira frowned. Why? It wasn't a question, it was a demand. They were hungry. Mason replied, simple words. Spoken without drama. Zero tilted her head, confused and angry. Many are hungry. Most take, not give. Mason didn't argue. He just looked at the children again. They are alive today, he said softly. That's enough for me. Zero didn't understand this kind of thinking, but it pulled her closer, like gravity. You're not one of us, she said, but they trust you already. They shouldn't, Mason said. I'm just a man who did one small thing. But no one else did, Zira answered, her voice lower now. They waited for help, and it never came. Not from our kind. Not from yours, Mason sighed, wiping his face with a dirty sleeve. I didn't do it to be special, he said. I did it because someone had to. Zira looked away, silent for a long time. Then she walked past him and sat beside the children. They watched her carefully, unsure if she was there to punish or protect, but she took out a dried root from her pocket and split it into small pieces. The children leaned in, surprised but eager. They began to chew slowly, whispering soft thanks in their own tongue. Mason watched from a short distance. Zero didn't speak to him again that day. But something had changed between them. A thread had formed, thin, quiet, but real. Later that night, Zero drew shapes in the dirt. She was teaching one of the kids. Their old clan symbols. Mason walked over and crouched nearby. He pointed to one of the symbols, the one for fire, and asked, What does that mean? Zira looked at him, surprised he cared to learn. It means warmth, she said. But also protection. Mason nodded slowly, then took a stick and drew a new shape next to it. It's a tent, he said. Hey. Place to rest. Zero raised an eyebrow. Yours. He shook his head. Ours. She stared at the drawing for a long time, then smiled barely. The kind of smile that meant something was beginning. Even if no one said it aloud, far in the distance. The sound of engines echoed faintly. Zira's ears perked up. Mason stood quickly. Looking toward the sound, they both knew more survivors or threats might be coming. The moment ended, the warmth of it fading like the last light of day. But Zira didn't run, and Mason didn't step back. They stood together now, even if they hadn't planned it. And the children behind them slept without fear for the first time in many nights. That night, the wind howled, louder than usual. The ruins groaned under its weight. Like the old bones of a fallen world, Mason sat by a small fire he built from broken chair legs and scraps. The children were wrapped in thin blankets, curled near the glow, still trembling from the cold. Zira watched from the shadows again. But not with doubt this time. She wasn't hiding anymore, just thinking. She had food in her pack-hard roots. Bitter but filling, but she didn't touch them. She had one blanket, worn and dirty, but it was warmer than what the children had. She looked at Mason. He was staring into the fire like he was trying to remember something from long ago, there, with sadness in his face. But something stronger, too. She had seen grief before, but not like this. Not mixed with quiet strength, without a word. Mason stood and unwrapped the thin blanket from around his shoulders. He walked over to the smallest child and laid it across her. Then he returned to the fire and sat down again. Shivering now, he didn't look for praise. Didn't even glance back. Zero stepped forward this time. The firelight caught her eyes sharp, golden and glowing in the dark. "You'll freeze," she said flatly. Mason looked up, surprised but calm. "I'll manage," he replied, his voice soft but steady. "Why?" she asked again. Not like before this time, it was different. Not a challenge, not anger, just confusion. Mason shrugged. "Because they matter." Zero sat across from him. The fire between them, she pulled the root from her pocket and tossed it to him. He caught it, looked at it, then looked back at her. "It's bitter," she warned, "but you'll survive." He nodded once and bit into it without hesitation. She watched him chew. Not because she cared how he ate, because she couldn't stop watching. "Your people," she began. "They always take, they destroy, they burn everything." "I'm not all of them," Mason replied, "and you're not all of yours." The silence that followed was heavy, but not cold. It was the kind of silence that built bridges instead of walls. Zero looked at the children again. They had stopped trembling. Even the smallest one was breathing evenly now. "The youngest," Mason said, pointing gently. "She's sick." Zero nodded slowly. "Her name is Telly. We need to find medicine," he said, his tone already forming a plan. "She won't last many more nights like this. There's an old supply truck near the ridge," Zero offered. "We looted it once, but maybe we missed something." Mason stood slowly, bones cracking from the cold. "We go at first light," he said. And Zira didn't argue. She simply nodded for the first time. They were not enemies, not strangers. They were something else, something forming in the space between firelight and frost. The wind screamed again, tearing through broken windows. Mason moved to block the gap with old boards, but his hands were shaking without a word. Zero moved beside him and helped. Together, they nailed 2 splinters into place. Not perfect, but better than nothing. When they were done, their fingers touched for a brief second. She pulled back fast, but didn't step away. "You're strange, human," she muttered. "I've been called worse," he said, and for the first time. She smiled, real one, not for him, not for show, because something warm had sparked inside her chest. She didn't remember the last time she had felt that. Later that night, Zero didn't return to her corner. She stayed near the fire. Not close, but not far either. Mason had fallen asleep, sitting up. Arms crossed, breath slow. The children were safe, and the fire was dying. Ashish. Zero took the last piece of her root and placed it beside Mason's foot. She didn't wake him, didn't speak, but before lying down, she whispered one word under her breath. "Chief." It wasn't meant for him to hear. But she needed to say it, not because he asked for it, but because deep inside he had already earned it. Asterisk. The sun rose slowly over the broken hills, pale. Light spilled across the shattered buildings like it was afraid to touch anything. Zero was already awake, crouched near the fire pit. Eyes scanning the road beyond the village, Mason stood beside her, rubbing his hands together. The cold biting through his jacket. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. There was understanding. Now, quiet and steady like the fire they had shared. Behind them, the children stirred, their faces softer than before. Not because life had improved, but because someone had stayed. That alone was enough to change them. They began walking before the sky turned fully blue. Zero led the way, boots crunching on old stone and ash. Mason followed, scanning the ruins with tired eyes. It wasn't far to the supply truck, but it felt like walking through old memories, burned buildings, melted signs. Claw marks on Walls's place had seen horror. Zira didn't flinch as they passed a broken statue of her people's gods. She just glanced once, then kept moving. Mason said nothing, but his jaw tightened. They reached the rusted truck, half buried under rubble. Zero jumped on top, her movements fast and sure. She pulled the hatch open with a loud groan of metal. Mason climbed up beside her, coughing from the dust. Inside were old medkits, cracked bottles, crushed containers. Most of it was useless. But in the far corner, wrapped in a shredded blanket, was a small box marked with the symbol for infection relief. Zero pulled it out with both hands. "This might help Telly," she said quietly. Mason took it, opened it carefully, and smiled. The vials were old but intact. He let out a small breath. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. "Then let's run," he said. And they did. Back at the ruined shelter, the children waited in a tight circle. They heard the footsteps first, then the voices, not Mason's, not Zara's, but older, louder, heavier. When Mason and Zero returned, they found 3 alien elders standing near the fire pit. Their robes were clean, too clean for this place. Their eyes cold, glowing with judgment. The tallest of them pointed at Mason. "You," he hissed. "What are you doing with our young?" Mason didn't step back. He looked at the children, who hid behind him now, then turned to face the elders. "I fed them," he said simply. "I stayed when no one else did." "You are not one of us," the elder snapped. "Your kind caused the fall, maybe?" Mason said, "But I didn't walk past hungry children like they were trash." Zira stepped between them before it got worse. "These young survived because of him," she said, her voice firm. "They trust him, they follow him." "They are lost," one elder replied. "They will forget our ways. Maybe that's a good thing." Zira whispered, but it cut like a blade. The elders stared at her now, like she had betrayed everything. "You speak for a human." Another elder said, "You shame your blood." Zira lifted her chin. "Then I'm proud of that shame." Mason said nothing. He just reached back and gently pulled the sick child forward. He held out the medicine. The girl looked up at the elders' eyes full of silent fear. None of the elders moved. None stepped forward, not even for a child. They turned around and walked away without another word. Zero stood frozen, fists clenched. Mason knelt down and opened the vial. Carefully, he gave the girl her first dose. Zero watched him, her chest tight with something that felt like pride and pain mixed together. As the sun rose higher, the children gathered around Mason again. They didn't ask, they didn't need to. One by one, they sat close, listening to his quiet voice as he explained how to stay warm, how to stay safe. Zira sat beside them, silent. But present, the elders were gone, but their shadows remained still. Something new had been planted here. Not fear, not tradition, but the idea of choice. And the children had already made theirs. The sky turned silver as the sun dipped low. Shadows grew long between the broken walls. The air felt heavy, as if something dangerous was crawling closer. Mason felt it first, a strange silence in the wind. Too deep, too wrong, Zero stood on a half-fallen tower scanning the far ridge. Her ears twitched, sharp and alert. She dropped to the ground in a crouch and whispered, "Something's coming." Mason didn't argue. He grabbed the children and motioned for them to get inside. The wind shifted, carrying a foul scent. It smelled of rot and old blood. Zira's eyes narrowed. Her hand reached for a sharp pipe she carried on her belt. Then she saw it. Rising over the hill, an alien beast, tall as a tank, crawling on 6 legs with a cracked shell and glowing mouth. It wasn't here to feed, it was here to kill. The children screamed, and Mason stood in front of them without thinking. His hands were empty, but he didn't move. He looked like a man ready to punch death in the face. Zero ran down from the tower, sliding into the dirt beside him. "You have no weapon," she hissed. He replied without looking at her. "I have them." Behind them, the children huddled close, staring at him like he was already a legend. The beast roared, shaking the ground. Its breath melted the grass. Where it stood, it began charging, legs pounding the earth, eyes locked on the human. Zira gritted her teeth and moved in front of Mason, but he pulled her back. "No," he said firmly. "I'll draw it away. Get them to safety. You'll die," she snapped. "Then I'll die doing something right," he answered without fear. Zira stared at him, heart racing. Then, before he could move, she growled and rushed forward herself. She slid under the beast's legs and stabbed her pipe into its underbelly. It screamed in rage and turned to follow her. Mason didn't waste the moment. He grabbed the children and ran to a nearby tunnel. He pushed them inside and turned back, ready to help. Zero rolled across the dirt, barely missing the creature's claws. It slashed at her, tearing part of her arm. But she kept moving. Mason picked up a rusted metal rod from the ground and charged forward. With a shout, he swung hard, hitting the beast in the eye. It staggered, just for a second. Zero jumped on its back and drove her pipe in deep. The creature thrashed and slammed into the wall. Trying to shake her off, Mason climbed up beside her, grabbed her hand, and together they held on. With one final scream, Zero ripped the pipe sideways, and green blood sprayed everywhere. The beast fell. Shaking the earth as it crashed, it let out one final hiss, then went still. For a moment, neither of them moved. They were covered in dirt, cuts, and strange alien blood. Mason dropped to one knee, panting. Zira fell beside him. "Breathing hard? You're insane," she whispered. "Maybe," he said with a smile. But it worked. The children peeked from the tunnel, eyes wide with shock and amazement. They ran out, surrounding both of them, cheering in their small voices. One child touched Mason's arm and whispered, "Chief." Another grabbed Zira's hand. Calling her protector, Zira didn't know what to say. She looked at Mason, who was already checking if the kids were hurt. Her heart beat fast, not from fear, but from something else. Respect. He didn't run when death came. He stood. He fought. And he protected what was not even his, as the stars appeared one by one. In the sky, the children dragged broken wood to rebuild the fire. Zero watched Mason as he wrapped the wounded child's leg with cloth. Her voice was low when she spoke. "They see you as more than a man now. I'm not a hero," Mason said quietly. Zero shook her head. "Doesn't matter what you call yourself. They already made their choice." And in the heart of a ruined world, under stars that had seen too much death, a new kind of hope began to rise, not from power, not from bloodline, but from sacrifice, from one man who had nothing and gave everything. The fire cracked softly in the middle of the broken room. The children sat close together, listening, as Mason told them a story. It was about the stars and how humans once looked at them with wonder, not fear. His voice was calm, warm, the kind that made you forget the cold for a while. Zira leaned against the wall, one arm bandaged from the fight. She watched the children's faces, how they lit up when Mason spoke. They listened to him in a way they never listened to the elders. They trusted him. Not because of his strength, but because he stayed when no one else did. Earlier that day, one of the boys had handed Mason a sharp rock tied to a stick. "Chiefs carry weapons," the boy had said, eyes glowing with pride. Mason had smiled and accepted it, holding the crude spear like it was something sacred. He didn't correct the boy. Didn't say he wasn't a chief, because deep down, he knew they already believed it. Every time he stood up first, every time he shared food or gave shelter, he became more than a man to them. He became a symbol of what they needed most. Hope. Zira stood and walked toward the fire. She sat beside Mason and handed him a small fruit she had found earlier. He looked at it, surprised. "You didn't have to," he said. "You didn't have to give them your last meal," she replied. They shared a quiet moment. Not romance, not yet, but respect. Real and rare. Zero didn't give things easily. Not food, not trust, not words, but she was giving all three now. Later that evening, the children brought him a blanket made of stitched scraps. They had worked all day, tying it together with tiny claws and fingers. "It's for our chief," the youngest said. Shy but proud, Mason took it, his hands shaking just a little, and placed it over his shoulders. He didn't speak much. He just smiled, and that smile said more than any speech could. One of the older kids drew a symbol in the dirt the shape of a hand holding fire. It was an old clan sign, usually meant for warriors, but tonight it meant something new. It meant protector, guardian, leader. Zero looked at the symbol, then at Mason. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "You're not one of us by blood, but you're one of us by choice." Mason looked down at the dirt, then back at her. "I never wanted to lead," he said. "Real leaders never do," she replied. That night, they sang an old song, a lullaby from Zara's childhood. One she thought she had forgotten, but as she sang it, the children joined, their voices soft. And Mason sat in the middle, the firelight dancing. Across his face, no one asked him to lead, no one voted, but everyone followed. Because in this broken world, strength was not enough. They needed someone who would bleed for them, starve for them, fight for them, and Mason already had. When the fire went out and the stars blinked above like distant eyes, Zero whispered, "Ah." Quiet truth to herself. He was never meant to be a chief. But he became the one they needed most. And in the silence that followed, the children slept with peace for the first time in many dark moons. The sun had not yet risen when the knock came, not a gentle one, but loud, hard. Full of authority, Mason opened his eyes, already on his feet before the children could stir. Zero was at the door before him, weapon in hand, eyes sharp. Outside stood the alien council, those same elders who had once walked away. But this time they weren't alone. Behind them stood a full group of survivors, older children, a few families, even wounded soldiers, all of them looking tired, hungry and lost. The tallest elder stepped forward. "We've seen what you've done," he said, not proud, not humble, just honest. "You turned broken children into something strong. You gave them a reason to smile again." Mason didn't speak. He simply stepped aside, letting the children be seen. They stood behind him, calm and unafraid, not because they were strong, but because they knew someone would protect them. The elder looked at the small blanket on Mason's shoulders, at the rough spear in his hand, at the way the children stood close to him, and he bowed his head. "Our people are without direction." The elder said, "We have traditions, laws, but we've lost our soul." He looked Mason in the eyes. "You have it." Zero stood beside Mason now. She didn't speak either, just waited. The elder's voice was quiet when he said, "The council offers you command of the rebuilding effort." Mason raised an eyebrow. "I'm not a commander," he replied. "I have no title, no bloodline, no name in your stories, but you have something more," Zero said, turning to face him. "You gave your last meal, your warmth, your strength, and never asked for anything." Mason looked at the children. He thought of the night he met them, hollow-eyed and starving, he thought. Of the cold, the beast, the fire, the songs, and he smiled, just a little. "I don't want power," he said slowly. "I only want one thing." Everyone leaned in, waiting for a demand, a price. But he said just one word. "Food." Whispers spread through the group. Food. For the children, not for himself. He didn't want land or control. He only wanted them to eat. Zero stepped forward. "If that's not a true leader," she said, "then we never knew what one was." The elder knelt, and behind him, so did the others, not in fear, not by force, but in respect. A human who had nothing now held the loyalty of a forgotten people. The children ran forward, pulling Mason by the hand. "Chief," they whispered, over and over. He laughed softly, then turned to Zira. "So, what now?" She looked at him. With steady eyes, "Now we build," she said. "Not just homes, but something better." That afternoon, the camp became something more. Tents were lifted. Walls were repaired. Food was shared. Mason didn't sit on a throne. He stood in the mud. Lifting bricks with his own hands, Zira stood beside him, giving orders, smiling more often now. By nightfall, the stars looked down at something they hadn't seen in a long time. Unity, not born from war or command, but from kindness. The children sang again. Their voices rose into the sky like a signal, not of victory, not of strength, but of survival and something greater. And in the center of it all stood a man with no crown, wrapped in a stitched-together blanket, holding a child in one arm and a shovel in the other. Leading not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Because when all hope was gone, he gave his last meal, and that was more than enough to change the world.